My name is Mike Albu, and I, with the help of Isabel, my colleague, we run the Beam Exchange, this platform that you're familiar with, where we exchange knowledge and information about market systems development. So we offer this space, the Grab the Mic space, for practitioners, implementers, consultants, evaluators to talk about their experiences in designing, managing, delivering market systems development programs. So today, we're lucky to have two consultants who were directed and led the evaluation of the Spring program. And Spring, well, Heidi and Gordon will explain what Spring is. But while we're waiting for people to enter the room, the main issue is that Spring was really a program for empowering women and girls using private sector engagement. So although it wasn't a market systems development program per se, it was in the end very much using approaches and methods and interventions that those of us who use market systems development as an approach will be familiar with. So let me introduce Heidi and Gordon. Heidi is a principal consultant at Tetra Tech, and she is the program director, or was the program director for the evaluation of the Spring program. So Tetra Tech were commissioned by FCDO to evaluate the Spring program. And she's been working in evaluation and development for over 18 years. And Gordon Freer is an independent consultant with numerous missions on international development programs, many of which have been evaluations of MSD programs. And he was the team leader for the Spring evaluation, looking at the previous 6 years of the program. Okay, so we are now 3 minutes into the start. I don't want to take up too much time by dawdling. Let's just see if we can get up to the magic 20 in the room. Otherwise, I'll hand over to you. I think, Heidi, you're going first, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we start? And I'm sure more people will join the room as we go on. Oh, Heidi's just disappeared. Are you still
Sorry,
there, Heidi?
I'm still here. Yeah. I just thought I'd be distracting. So.
Oh no, we like to see your. We like.
Oh,
to
you
see
do. Okay. All right. I can start my video again. Okay. So for the agenda today, I'll just give a very brief overview of Spring program. I think it's important just to sort of lay that out very clearly from the beginning. Then we'll sort of talk a bit about, for the record, about this not being sort of MSD, but how it links and how it's important. We will share with you some Spring lessons, working with the private sector partners and how to unlock a market. And then finally, the last bit of lessons around the Spring will be about how they link to MSD, and then open the floor up for discussion. So that's right. I think that'll be good. And our presentation won't be too long, so we can get into the discussion. Okay, so, oops, sorry. So just an introduction to Spring. So Spring was a 5-year program, and its donors were Australian Aid, USAID, and at some point in the first year and a half was also Nike Foundation as well. And these donors really wanted to focus on working with and through the private sector in order to work on empowerment for girls. The idea was that essentially the age range of the girls were 10 to 19 years of age, and that working with and through the private sector, they could reach economic empowerment with these girls. Now, over time, the program itself was innovative and adaptive, and it changed. One of the major things that it changed about was that it changed in terms of the focus being just economic empowerment for adolescent girls to changing to 5 themes of empowerment. So eventually it broadened out to learn, earn, stay safe, stay healthy, and well-being. And as I said, this was done over 5 years, and it was done through essentially 4 rounds of working with businesses. So 2 rounds in South Asia and 2 rounds in East Africa. And again, trying to focus on adolescent girls between the ages of 10 and 19. So I'll hand over to you now, Gordon.
Thanks, Heidi. So as Mike mentioned right at the beginning, Spring wasn't an MSD program, and I think it's important to understand that. Sort of. In the initial concept notes, in the initial design of Spring, market systems development was mentioned. It was played with, it was toyed with in the initial design. But by the time the program really got implementation underway, the focus had moved away from market systems development. And the question then is, why are we presenting at the Beam Exchange? Isn't the Beam Exchange about market systems development? Well, there are a number of similarities between Spring and MSD programs that those of us familiar with MSD will recognize. Spring looked at sustainable systemic change within the broader environment. It partnered with private sector partners or players in order to bring about developmental objectives. It talked about ecosystem change. In other words, change within that broader environment. And finally, it expected the private sector partners to continue to achieve those developmental objectives even after the program came to an end. So even though Spring wasn't an MSD program, even though we didn't look at things like adopt, adapt, expand, and respond, I look at Spring and I say, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, might it actually be a duck? So drawing from this, we think there are lessons that Spring will have that are applicable to the broader MSD community. Thanks, Heidi. Next slide. So there are three broad clusters. I'm hoping Heidi's moved on to the next slide. There we go. Thank you. There are three broad clusters of lessons that we'd like to be able to share with you today. In the first cluster, we'll share a number of lessons around the fact that Spring was an iterative program. And I know in MSD, we often talk about adapting and adopting. So what did Spring do in terms of adapting and adopting? It reflected on its implementation. It made changes and implemented again. There's a number of specific lessons that we want to draw out there. In the second and third clusters of the lessons that we want to share with you, they relate to how the program worked with businesses at different stages of their business growth path. So in the second cluster, we'll share with you lessons that the program learned working with early stage businesses. And in the third cluster, lessons it learned working with more mature businesses. But let's unpack that first cluster first, about Spring being iterative. Three lessons here that we'd really like to highlight. Although Spring didn't tie itself down to any specific sectors in business, it partnered with businesses in the financial sector, it partnered with businesses in the health sector, the agricultural sector, the education sector, the IT sector. It did learn about what type of businesses to work with in each of the different sectors. The program was designed to be iterative, and it was designed also to work through 4 different implementation phases or waves of activity, if you will. In the first phase, just let that motorbike disappear. In the first phase, the Spring partnered with businesses that had identified an area that they thought they could utilize in order to be able to empower adolescent girls. It could have been a product or it could have been a service. But for a variety of reasons, when it came to selecting businesses in the second phase, the program chose to work with more mature businesses. We'll unpack some of those reasons in one of the later clusters. However, there were challenges with the businesses as well, with the mature businesses. And in the third and fourth implementation phases, the program partnered with a mix of businesses, both those early stage businesses as well as the more mature businesses. None of the businesses in the third or fourth cluster, the businesses in the third or fourth cluster were neither exclusively early stage nor late stage. And the lesson here, of course, is that the program was adaptive and it wasn't afraid to change with whom it partnered. It looked at how far it managed to get in implementation and said, we think we can do better by choosing different partners. The second lesson under this cluster is that the program changed the frequency and intensity with which it engaged the businesses. So each wave was structured around what the program called boot camps. And these were intense face-to-face periods where the businesses and the program implementation team really got to grips with what this product or service was that the different businesses were trying to use to empower girls. In the first phase, there was only really one boot camp, only really one intense period of engagement. It was supplemented a little bit later in that wave with presentations to Sankalp. But in phases 2 and 3, there were 2 boot camps, Boot Camp 1 and Boot Camp 2. Boot Camp 1 being a more global overall focus with all of the businesses there, and Boot Camp 2 focusing on individual businesses through very specific interventions. And then in the final wave, in the 4th phase, the program actually looked at bringing in a 3rd boot camp as part of its initial selection process, which it called Boot Camp 0. The lesson here, of course, is that frequency and intensity of engagement with the businesses also has to reflect how much the businesses are willing to tolerate, as well as how much value they see that they're getting out of the program itself. And finally, the 3rd lesson in this specific cluster, the selection process. Because the program was designed to be iterative and reflective, the implementers changed their emphasis in each different phase, hoping to do better. And so much so that in the final wave of activity, the 4th wave, in spite of being contractually bound to work with 20 businesses, the implementers negotiated a contractual amendment to only work with 18. They didn't want to simply select businesses in order to be able to achieve a specific quantifiable target. They said, we really feel that we can add value to 18. We don't want to have to work with 20 and just have 2 businesses that are hanging on just in order for us to be able to reach target. Thanks, Heidi. So the second cluster of lessons that we want to share with you are the lessons the businesses learned in working with early stage businesses. Sorry, Heidi, I'm not seeing that slide come up yet.
Sorry, I'm struggling. My mouse is frozen. Okay.
There we go. Thank you very much. So the second cluster of lessons is working with these early stage businesses. And I know this is something that many of the businesses in, or many of the programs working with MSD confront issues here. Perhaps the most important lesson is that many of the businesses identified as early stage lacked the depth of knowledge and the depth of resources the program really needed to be able to leverage in order to achieve their developmental objectives. Although many of the ideas that the businesses had at that period of time had validity and had merit and might have gained traction over a longer period of time, Spring only had 9 months to work with these businesses. And they recognized that this limitation of resources the businesses could leverage and the 9 months didn't make sense to choose those businesses. And this lack of foundation within the early stage businesses also didn't allow the program, Spring itself, to achieve its objectives. It also didn't allow the businesses to be able to leverage sufficiently that the investment that they were making in Spring was worthwhile. And this lack of foundation was also reflected in the business's inadequate cash flow and similar lack of other resources like human capacity. In the first phase of the program, many of the early stage businesses were actually looking to Spring to be almost like an angel investor. And this, of course, wasn't the purpose of the program. The program was a partner. Yes, it had money. Yes, it had economic resources. Yes, it had technical assistance that it could provide to those businesses to assist them. But it was really looking at partnering. It wasn't an investor, and it definitely wasn't an angel investor. The program was definitely a partner looking for equally empowered partners with whom it could do business. And then, as already mentioned, many of the early stage businesses lacked human capacity. They often revolved around the drive and vision of the founder, and this singular focus also resulted in a number of cases of tunnel vision. The founder was not able to move away from a single idea or vision, even when they were advised to do so by the people they had gone to for advice. And as a result of that, the founder possibly wasn't able to see alternative paths to achieve very similar objectives. The example that I can give here is a food processing company in Rwanda, and it illustrates all of these 3 lessons. They had a unique product. They had a unique processing technology, which is in fact patented. They had an international market, but it lacked adequate resources to be able to empower girls. it didn't catch the vision of being able to empower those girls. They didn't have deep enough pockets or sufficient human capacity to be able to mentor and support the girls. The whole idea behind this business was in diversifying its procurement model using girl-centered cooperatives. But unfortunately, this business just wasn't up to that task. It really was limited by its founder vision, by looking at expanding its market and selling its product elsewhere. Thanks, Heidi. And the final cluster of lessons that we'd like to share with you revolve around the program working with more mature businesses. Again, an issue that I know many MSD programs deal with. In the first instance, Spring struggled to gain traction within a corporate strategy and an operational plan. Larger, more complex institutions or businesses often have multiple divergent demands. They have their own ecosystem, even within the company. And Spring wasn't working with them, but was often seen as an add-on. It wasn't integrated into the business. It wasn't seen as being a partner. It was seen as being an additional factor. And as a result, it was often difficult for Spring to gain a prominent place on the agenda of decision makers or strategy makers within the business, and therefore to ask the business or to convince the business to leverage sufficient resources to achieve the objectives. Secondly, Spring struggled to identify the individuals within that corporate environment with whom they could partner or who could act as a champion to the Spring cause throughout the whole program and business interaction. While one individual might appear enthusiastic and initially take up that Spring cause, of course, they belong within a corporate animal, and corporate agendas and resource allocation often saw this individual redeployed. And this loss of institutional memory and institutional relationship impacted on the program's partnership with that particular business. And then finally, the last lesson in this final cluster. Similarly to the challenge this program encountered working with early stage businesses, Spring was often sidelined as a priority because of corporate tunnel vision. With the corporate being unable to identify and partner, with Spring being unable to identify and partner with an individual or champion, being one of multiple items on a corporate agenda didn't leave it with a space with which it could explain itself, with which it could show how it was adding value to the corporate agenda. And as a result of that, Spring itself as a program was often lost within the corporate hierarchy and strategy. Again, a single example illustrates these three lessons. A large Pakistani telecommunications company partnered with Spring in the second wave of implementation. The company was incredibly keen to develop a mobile banking platform focused specifically at women, and it initially saw Spring as a perfect target or perfect opportunity to devise this product, to develop it, and to pilot it. And it had more than enough resources to be able to throw at this. They really wanted to access Spring, not for any financial benefit that they could gain out of the program, but rather for the technological expertise that they knew the program was bringing. However, as a result of corporate acquisitions during the Spring program and individuals being redeployed, as a result of that acquisition, the business actually dropped out of the Spring program halfway through that implementation wave. And as a result of all these three lessons, or these three clusters of lessons, the question that we're left to ask is whether there is, in fact, a perfect type of business partner. One who isn't too large, one who isn't too small, one who's not too corporate, one who's not too early stage. Is there, in fact, a Goldilocks business out there? And then I'll hand back to Heidi.
Okay, so we have a few lessons about unlocking the market in relation to Spring. And I think the first one to talk about really is the idea that girls and markets themselves are not homogenous. And while some of us might know that, I think this is a real learning point for the businesses. Again, as I said before, the developmental aims of the program was to target girls the ages of 10 and 19. But we know that that's a huge age range. We know that the needs of girls who are 10 versus the needs of girls who are 19 vary tremendously. We also know it varies within a culture. And as a result, we also know that girls belong to different groups, right? So they belong to their communities, maybe ethnic or religious groups. Many of them belong to different schools. So they have different groups and different identities. And for the businesses, this is a real learning point. They basically were able to understand that by looking at girls in different ways and not as a homogenous group, that they could tailor their services and their prototype, and that the messaging and the ways in would vary for them. So this was a big learning point. I think it's also important to reflect back on the different access points for the markets. So for example, it was always meant to benefit girls. And in fact, the girls were the target, but the businesses learned that perhaps they had different entry points into the market. So one example is a business called Fight Back, which taught girls self-defense. And originally they were going straight to the girls, but then they learned afterwards that they were better off targeting head teachers and actually going through schools. And this was a better way of actually targeting girls in terms of being clients and end users. And so I think that's a really important lesson for most of the businesses. One of the things that's related to this is the idea of gatekeepers as well. So we know that essentially there are gatekeepers that can act as focal points, but they can also act as barriers. Using the example again of Fight Back, some of the parents were hesitant about having their daughters take self-defense courses. They didn't like the perhaps messaging around this. So they went to siblings, older siblings in particular, and in some cases male siblings, and spoke to them about the benefits of the program. And so the siblings themselves were able to also go and advocate to the parents on the girls' behalf. Again, about access to markets, we know that women are part of the group, but again, how they provide this and how they engage with them is very different, and this became tailored by the businesses. The next lesson on this is adapt for those with limited economic power. So again, the idea, because Spring was a business accelerator and it was a developmental program, was that it was essentially supposed to benefit the sort of poorest of the poor. And one of the challenges with this is that the businesses obviously joined with an altruistic nature in mind, but at the end of the day, it's really about return on investment. And one of the things they found out is that actually the poorest of the poor for adolescent girls are often limited in terms of their economic access or their time resource. And so it became very difficult for them to actually find them as a financial market. So the program had discussions and there were adaptations made. And it was agreed that instead of the poorest of the poor as a target, that the target would become vulnerable girls, and that would be defined with the businesses. But in most cases, it essentially became one tier up from the poorest of the poor. So still benefiting girls and meeting developmental objectives, but there was some flexibility and adaptation so that businesses still found it viable for them and could participate. The final lesson on this, unlocking the market, is the human-centered design angle. This was brought in to work with businesses so that they could have a better understanding of their targets and how to access them. What were their needs, what were their desires, and how could they provide benefits and services to them that were of value. This also ties back to the idea of how to access them, so identifying gatekeepers as well and niches in the market. And this tool being used was found a huge benefit to businesses. Even after the program ended, we've gone back and done a review with businesses, and almost all businesses are still using human-centered design or some form or adaptation of human-centered design, either with the original prototype or to develop new products and services as they move forward. So what have we learned about this in relation to MSD? Well, we learned through the Spring program that private sector resources can be leveraged. We know this to be true. Through the Spring program, over 2 million girls were impacted. So this is a huge win and a huge example of how it can be done. But one of the things that we do learn is that you have to make sure that it's right for the businesses, that they will invest, that they do want to participate. Many of them have this as part of a sort of better agenda, but that ultimately at the end of the day, there has to be that financial return on investment for them to continue to engage. We also learned that private sector players will adapt and change. So as I said earlier, the target audience originally was 10 to 19. Those were the age of the girls for beneficiaries. But we know that actually businesses changed a lot of their products along the way. We also know that they changed some of their targeting audience. So some of them expanded outside of that range from 10 to 19 to women in their early 20s. And I think that's important because it helps for developmental programs to understand that there has to be some flexibility and some adaptability as well. That if you stay rigidly and you just keep businesses in with a narrow focus, that this can inhibit them and limit their participation, causing maybe in some cases some to drop out of the program. And so we think that that's important both in terms of design, but also implementation. It's also important for data collection as well. When you just have rigid perimeters and collecting information on a small segment of the population, you can also miss out on the total beneficiaries. For example, a lot of the spring program could have benefited much more people, but they didn't collect data beyond the age of 19. So we missed some out. Also, some of the products and services, for example, a sustainable flooring would benefit a family, but again, those numbers weren't maybe recorded. So it's about adapting and changing with the businesses and the businesses' need and expanding as part of a developmental program to try to capture that. The next point is invisible untapped markets. So we know they exist. We know that women are end users and customers. We also know that they're part of the value chain. But it's really about working with businesses to have them understand who their end users are and who their value chain is and working with them. We know that as part of untapping this market, there's a big thing. We also know that having women in the value chain sometimes requires additional resource. For example, they may have less time, less resource. They're valuable, but therefore it means that you may reach fewer of them if you invest more in reaching them. And then finally, non-traditional partners might open doors. So the idea of going to other people who weren't originally your target end user or customer. So for example, a fight back, going to head teachers and really targeting them for the product sales, even though the benefit is girls. Or as I mentioned earlier with gatekeepers, working with them and through them. There's another example of Learnabots who had used tech ed to work with girls. These were apps on smartphones. Again, sometimes parents were hesitant about having the girls have access to the internet and tech phones. And by working with both parents, head teachers, and siblings to convey the important aspects of having girls reach these apps and do these lessons on phones, they were able to overcome this. So it's really important to work with these sort of non-traditional partners for businesses in order to achieve the developmental goals. We know that this has happened in other places. I think Gordon has another example of PropCom in Nigeria who worked with religious groups to benefit, I think it was chicken vaccinations. So looking at these sort of non-traditional partners really does help open doors. And businesses hadn't necessarily considered this before the spring program. So now maybe I'd like to hand it back to Mike and we can start the discussion.
That's great. Well, many thanks, Heidi and Gordon, for keeping very tightly to time despite all the technical problems. Right. Very clear presentation. There've been a few questions now, and I forgot to mention that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So there's been 3, I think, already, and Gordon's actually very kindly answered a couple of them in text already while Heidi was speaking. But I would like to actually go to one of them again, because you were just talking about human-centered design, Heidi, and Malte asked, can you explain a little bit more about how human-centered design was applied, and were the businesses trained to use it, and how was it sort of operationalized?
Yeah, absolutely. Gordon, do you want to tackle this, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. So Malte, I think, first of all, I think human-centered design, core central part of the whole Spring DNA. In fact, it was written into the original design document. Can HCD work as an instrumental tool in developmental programs? And it was actually a central part of our evaluation as well. Businesses were trained to do it themselves. That was one of the intense parts of Bootcamp 1. What is HCD? How does it work? How do you apply it? And they were taken through an incredibly intensive process of understanding the parameters of HCD and then encouraged to use it to design their products and services. So in short, the answer is yes, businesses applied it for themselves. But Isabel has also put a link in the chat box to a blog that's just been published on HCD application to MSD programs. And I see Ellen has also just put something in the chat box about learning more about the spring curriculum, which is a large part of it, of course, focused on HCD. Heidi, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just talked about it briefly in the presentation, but the program ended in September 2019, and we went back earlier this year and reached out to the businesses to find out who was still using HCD. And as I mentioned, almost all of them were using it or using a version of it. And I think that shows how valuable the businesses found it if they carried on continuing to use it for product development and refinement and targeting. I think that speaks volumes.
Could you give us a specific example of a human-centered design? Actual, one example of a product or a service that was emerged from that process.
Yeah. How long have you got, Mike? So one business was, I think we actually might mention this in the blog. One service was looking at getting adolescent girls into savings. So using solidarity groups to convince girls to save. They found that girls just didn't have the maturity to be able to manage themselves within a group. They didn't understand the value of money. They didn't understand basically the mechanics around how to run a group. And this is understandable. We're dealing with 14, 15, 16-year-old girls. They just don't have that level of life experience. That was the original design. And then they went back. Why weren't the groups working? Why weren't they gaining traction here, and realized what the problem was? And in the second iteration, then began pairing those adolescent girl solidarity groups with older women from other solidarity groups that were part of their network, where the older women actually acted as a mentor to the adolescent girls, showing them how the group worked, showing them how the importance of money, showing them how to save, showing them what they could do, sharing life lessons with them. That was all done through HCD. I'm sure Heidi's got other examples she can share.
Yeah, I mean, well, the fight back one, I mean, just to build on that, again, the idea was originally targeting girls through self-defense classes, but they realized actually a more effective way to reach girls was to target head teachers and convince head teachers in schools to take up the program rather than going to each girls individually. And they had greater uptake as a result. And of course, reaching out to the siblings to help them explain to the parents why that was important.
Great, thank you. So look, there's a question from Julia Kratky, which hasn't quite made it into the Q&A yet, but I'm sure it will, but it's in the chat. And she's asking whether you can give an example of an initiative relating to the earning of the five, your five, that Spring had 5 different sort of themes, didn't it? And one was around earning. So is there an example from the an earning initiative that is continuing to be generating results now after the program ended? Yeah, so there's actually a couple of examples. Some weren't as successful as we thought. In fact, the earning and saving component of those 2 themes probably reached the least number of girls, and that's simply because it took incredible investment, an incredible amount of resources from the businesses to be able to place girls within the value chain. It was one of the reasons that the thematic areas expanded beyond simply economic empowerment towards vulnerable girls. But a couple of examples you asked for, Julia. One is a Grenadillo or passion fruit farming initiative in Uganda, which used HCD to empower the girls from vulnerable homes with unstable backgrounds, and basically mentoring them through a life growth experience, but still employing them and using them as workers within their passion fruit business. So those girls earn. Another one in Myanmar, working with girls who had been brought out of the sex industry and training them to manufacture jewelry and then selling that jewelry basically in a social enterprise. So those girls also earning. But as I mentioned, earn was probably one of the least effective in reaching a great number of adolescent girls. Thanks, Mike. Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to broaden out again. Another very interesting question that's in the chat. But please, by the way, do try and put your questions in the Q&A box for procedural reasons. But Selina's asking whether in focusing on adolescent girls, the program found that normative roles limited the impact of the program, or was the program able to address these with the private sector partners? So the examples she's giving is about, for example, childbearing age and expectations around adolescent girls marrying, for example.
Heidi, do you want to take that? Do you want me to give it a try?
You try, and then I'll think. Yeah.
Okay.
There was the one with the honey.
Yeah, go ahead.
One, the honey candy one, which was.
Go ahead. I'll mention Toto Health, but you go ahead with Honey Care.
So in terms of, I think, reinforcing, there was one particular business which was brought in, which I think was playing on those normative ideas, which was around the fact that essentially girls eat candy, girls like candy, and a better form of candy for them is honey candy, and that they would purchase this candy essentially. But I think one of those was it just proved that it wasn't a good business, it wasn't a good theory, and it wasn't an approach, and so it didn't last. And I think that is sort of building on those sort of negative normative stereotypes which come in. But I think there's many examples of better ones. But I do there is this. I'll let you talk about Toto Health in a moment because that's good. But I think there was a lot of learning that went on, I think, through HCD about really getting to understand their targets and what their needs were, and working away from generalizations and normative ideas of girls. That was part of the process. There was, gender advisors and HCD to really work through that with businesses. Yeah.
So I think one of the areas where the program had the greatest reach of impact was in healthcare, and specifically in societies where adolescent girls, where women were restricted in their movements and in their social interactions. However, with regards to the normative ideal of girls, I think there were a number of businesses that are worth highlighting that challenged that ideal, and to some extent were successful, and in other areas not so successful. So a business in Pakistan challenging the norm that STEM subjects was appropriate for boys only, and getting girls interested in science, technology, and engineering through training teachers to use interactive programming lessons with robots. Another one, using adolescent girls as agents to sell goods and services to their other adolescent girl neighbors, wasn't as successful. And the reason that wasn't successful, even though the foundation of the program was well thought through and well established, was the social environment. The neighbors didn't like adolescent girls going door to door to sell particular goods, even though they knew who this girl was and they knew she was part of the neighborhood. It just wasn't socially acceptable for adolescent girls to be employed in that way. And so they had to change that whole approach. So I think there's a balance here. It's not just a normative vision of girls. They had to be sensitive to a specific social and cultural context as well. Thanks. Ellen's just pointing out that Maya Appa tackled norms in Myanmar. So Maya Appa was again, using science technology, they developed an app that was used as an educational app to deal with menstrual health. And the whole thrust behind their initiative was to normalize menstruation, to make it a normal subject that girls could talk about quite openly, and again approaching it from a very unique perspective by using an app that girls then could access on their smartphones. Thanks.
Very interesting. Sanya asked a question earlier about how the expectations of the partners were managed. Was it done were there formal legal arrangements in these partnerships, or was it done through other kinds of mechanisms?
So the businesses acted independently. There wasn't a formal partnership with regards to their product and service with Spring. Spring was a mentor, an accelerator, a supporter of the product or service, but the product or service remained the property, and the idea of the product or service remained within the business itself. Spring never took any interest in it at all. So that I don't think there was I think that's what the question is possibly asking. It wasn't as if Spring had invested in the company and therefore needed some type of return on that investment. That wasn't the situation at all. The products or services remained within the business at all times.
Yeah.
Right. So where support was given, maybe, whether that's technical assistance or grants, that was done without any legal contract, but more just through.
Well, I mean, there would have been a contract with Spring saying, we're going to give you X amount of money, so that they could expect it must be paid into this account. But it wasn't. There wasn't a legal contract in the sense that Spring was looking for a return. No.
Right. Okay. Can I ask you my own question while we wait for some others to come up? But I'm just curious, just to clarify for everyone here, you guys evaluated Spring, you didn't implement it. So is there anything you'd like, any reflections on the process of evaluating this program? And obviously that's a big topic, but it's one close to my heart with the Beam Evidence Review recently. What for you is sort of stand out kind of reflections on the evaluation process itself?
I'll definitely let Heidi take a lead in this.
No, I mean, I think there was a lot to learn from the program. I think it was really good. I think the main part was the fact that was the adaptation. I think the learning perspective was fantastic about the program. I think that was really, really good. I think they learned from each sort of round and then adapted and changed. I think the support that they provided to businesses got better and better because they tailored it more to what businesses needed. From an evaluation perspective, I think we struggled because we accompanied them throughout the entire program. As Gordon said, each sort of round of working with businesses was about 9 months. And so we were supposed to provide support and learning into each round so they could also adapt. And we felt like we were often running at full speed in order to get enough learning to feed into the next round. But that's, those are the challenges of adaptive programming is doing learning, but doing it so that it's obviously, it's of a good enough quality and standard, but also that it's rapid enough that it can feed into the adaptation itself. Yeah.
So just to clarify, Tetra Tech had a longitudinal kind of contract to run right the way through the 5 years alongside providing that monitoring, evaluation, and learning function to the program.
Yeah, and even afterwards, we're still under contract. We're doing this sort of learning and still some impact evaluations. So we actually extended beyond the contract of implementation. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. And were there any issues around or questions raised around the degree of independence for you as evaluators alongside this program when you had such a sort of long-term relationship with them? And how were they managed?
It's a great question, Mike, and I think it's a very valid question. I think yes, there were questions asked. I think most importantly, there were often a number of times where we were called on to act, and we actually put our foot down, our collective foot, if you will, as the evaluation team, and said no, because that goes beyond the limits of what we regard as our independence. We are not providers in any way. We step back, we observe, we learn, we reflect, we provide input, but we do not make decisions. So I think there was a number of times where we were called on, even in our communications, we were called on to make decisions or to act in a certain way, and we actually had to pull back and say, no, we can't do that. We have to let the program run its own course. Yes, we can provide suggestions and advice and input, and we had a really solid working relationship with the implementation team. And just on that note, I'd like to point out that Emily's on as a guest here as well, and she's just put up a really good link to some of the more to one of the points that was made. We've also actually developed a infographic and have published a paper and presented a paper on learning from 3 perspectives, which is what we as evaluators learned from this process, what we as evaluators, what the donors learned from this process, and what the implementers themselves learned from this process. And it's a 3-way collaborative piece that is available on the website. So were questions asked about our independence? Yes. Were we able to defend ourselves? I think we defended ourselves adequately. Yeah.
Great. So there's also an interesting question in the chat from Lindy about, now this maybe you can tell us what you observed here, but you've talked a lot about the adaptability, the iterative and adaptive nature of the program, and of course that begs the question of how was that negotiated between the implementer and the donor, and how smooth was that process, and what have we learned? What did you learn as evaluators about that relationship? This is again a topic that's very close to the beam exchange interests. We have these papers called the procurement series, which kind of address this question. So I'm curious what might have been learned in the spring experience.
Heidi, adaptation, learning from adaptation.
I mean, I think it was challenging. I mean, again, I sort of made the example from our side about, this sort of running alongside. I mean, the theory of change was adapted how many times, Gordon? I don't know.
7.
7. And so I think that is also a challenge. It's fantastic for the program because it gets clearer and clearer about what they're trying to achieve and how they'll achieve it. But for an evaluator, it can be very tricky as the program has moved on. So we had to adapt our evaluation to the adaptive program. And perhaps saying on the fly is a bit too flippant, because we actually really did think about it very, very carefully. But yes, it definitely posed some challenges. And again, I think that question about the adaptation, how frequent, is a good question. I think in many ways, because there's sort of 4 rounds of working with businesses, that was clear. Some other programs that are adaptive and maybe don't have those clear lines, it might be more challenging for them.
So Lindy was actually asking specifically, do you think that the ability of Spring to adapt was driven because it was sort of written into the program design, or was it to do with key individuals in the donor mission who showed that flexibility and were able to allow it?
Yeah, I think in that case, that relationship between the implementers and the donors, I think the donors had this idea that the program would be adaptive, and they were really looking for something that was iterative and would respond to changing dynamics. And they appointed a team that they thought would be able to do that job. And the team came on board and just, they were incredibly enthusiastic about this. They relished in their failure because they recognized it as an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to adapt. And to be quite frank, I think they adapted more than the donors had ever imagined possible. So much so that I suspect that those contractual negotiations were actually, I think in some cases, the donors might have said, what on earth is going on here? Because they're asking for contractual amendments on things that we never thought possible. And that's actually reflected in our learning from 3 perspectives. This adaptation process, the consortium the implementation consortium was made up of 2 main partners, and one of those partners was incredibly enthusiastic to adapt and change and just continually reflect and learn. And because that's their nature, they are an HCD consultancy, and they want to ensure that they were reaching or delivering the best possible product. So I think, yeah. I think that in itself was a lesson. Developmental donors expect a certain level of adaptation that I don't think they expected the level of adaptation that was available within the commercial environment. Yeah.
But they managed it. But nevertheless, they managed it.
Yeah.
It was definitely managed,
absolutely.
the professional
So
relationship all the way through.
Yeah.
Kudos to the donors for FCDO in this case for coping
Definitely.
with. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Back. There's another question that I wanted to throw. So change direction slightly in the Q&A. Heidi, you mentioned about the importance of not sort of treating women and adolescent girls as a homogenous group. So someone called AD is wondering if it was if you looked at the income level of the girls as a characteristic. So whether that affected the inclusion of girls in the program, and in particular, AD is asking about the inclusion of very marginalised girls, like girls with disabilities. So was income level a kind of a constraint on participation?
So I think just to be clear that the girls weren't in the program. So just to be clear about it, the girls were end users of products or services, or they were in the business value chain, which I think is just an important distinction. I think, again, it was something that was heavily discussed over and over again between the donors and the implementation team, and sometimes we weighed in because there was that question of how do you really benefit, especially when, again, at the very beginning, the design was poorest of the poor, but you're working with businesses and through businesses and trying to, reach and impact girls' lives, but it's still, at the end of the day, meet the financial targets of businesses for it to become, viable for them. So I think that there wasn't necessarily an exact discussion about income levels. I don't know if I'm wrong about this, Gordon, you can jump in a second, but I think that there was so much consideration. It really went country by country and funding round by funding round to really find businesses that were targeting the right way. But whether it was rigorous, I'm not sure if those kind of financial levels were put in. In terms of the other questions around disability and things like that, again, there weren't specifications around disability specifically, but there was a very methodical process about the vetting and selecting of businesses. And discussion heavily on that. Gordon, I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Maybe just the fact that for the businesses themselves, income of the girls was often a factor in determining the success of their prototype. And they often had to adapt their prototype as a result of that. So initially, they might have had a great idea that girls would be able to access this product or service, but on the initial iteration of the initial design, they realized that the economic power of this target market, these adolescent girls, was actually more limited than they thought, and they therefore had to make adjustments to their model in order to be able to gain traction. And then just with regards to disabilities, we didn't have a great show of disability. We conducted 8 impact evaluations of 8 very specific businesses. We asked the Washington short set of questions in each of those impact evaluations, but in none of those evaluations was there a significant percentage of girls who identified as disabled. Thanks.
Okay, we're running towards the end of the hour, guys. So I just want to say, for one thing, if you've got time, please do fill in the survey, very short survey form. There's a link in the chat box now, just to let us know what you thought about the webinar. So, I've got one kind of broadening out question to finish with, which you could either or both of you could respond to, from Jim Tanburn. Which models or incentives or businesses were best suited to achieving lasting systemic change? And were there any changes achieved beyond the partner businesses themselves?
Go
ahead, Gordon. I'll let you tackle that one first.
Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Jim. I always end on the high note, don't you? With regard to systemic change, I honestly don't think, from an MSD perspective, I honestly don't think we could claim systemic change. I think what we might be able to claim is that some businesses have learned that there are invisible markets that they can tap into, but I would be very hesitant to suggest that there is systemic change. And fortunately, I don't have to, because it falls outside the scope of the evaluation. And sorry, Mike, I forgot the second part of the question.
Second part of the question was what changes were achieved beyond the businesses, which is sort of the same sort of question, really.
Yeah. So in a few businesses, there were unanticipated changes. I think one that just sticks out in my head was the Pakistani business that empowered girls through the programming of robots. The teachers that it empowered to be able to facilitate those lessons recognized that the training methodology was incredibly valuable for their non-STEM related colleagues, and wanted the business to come back and actually teach the teachers in the methodology. Nothing to do with STEM, nothing to do with empowering girls, nothing to do with robotics, but rather teach us how to teach in this way because it's incredibly effective. So just one unexpected change that I can think of. There were a couple of others, but that's the one that sticks out. Heidi, I'm not sure if you can think of any offhand.
No, but I think that was important, especially during COVID as well.
Mm.
The remote learning was a sort of secondary benefit, but it was huge. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, our time is up, and I think that's a good place to sort of finish. It's been really fascinating, interesting listening to you, Heidi and Gordon. I've learned a lot about Spring, and I'm sure others have too. So just a big thank you.
Great. Thank you too.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Isabel.